right. Perfect. The session is being recorded so that you can relive these valuable insights later on. The recording links will be provided in the chat at the end of the webinar, so please stay tuned for that. For optimal sound quality, we kindly request that all attendees keep their microphones muted throughout the entire session. There will be a designated time where you will be able to ask questions, which will be at the end of the webinar today, but you may also type in your questions into the Zoom control panel and we'll keep tabs on them and answer them at the end of the session if time allows. Now, without any further delay, I present to you our esteemed presenter, Dr. Angela Love and Elise Bowens. Take it away.
Thank you so much and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started and jump into our conversation today around compassion fatigue. This is an interesting topic and I appreciate all of your interest in our conversation today. Again, I am Dr. Angela Love, a project consultant with CPS-HR. I've been in this organization not quite a year, but on my way. I'm a lead project consultant in the DEI division of the organization. I also am executive director of an educational nonprofit where we provide expanded learning and enrichment services to our local school districts. All of the organizations and school districts that I work for are school sites I work for are Title I schools. And that brought out a lot of things just in working with particular populations. And that's how I began to study and really understand compassion fatigue. So I, again, appreciate you all being with us today. Feel free to type your comments and your questions into the chat. And as time allows, we will be sure to get those questions answered for you. My email address will also be presented at the end. And so if I don't get to your questions, please feel free to email me directly. All right. So today we're going to go over a few different topics. We're going to take inventory and we'll describe what that means in a little bit. We're going to talk about mental health. We're going to define compassion fatigue, also known as secondary traumatic stress. We're going to talk about burnout and compassion fatigue. What are some of the similarities and what are the differences? And then, of course, we're going to go over some coping strategies and tools. As we talk about compassion fatigue, we, of course, want to leave you equipped with the resources that you need to address your own compassion fatigue and assist your colleagues and peers as well. So how did we get here? Of course, we need to talk about the historical context of compassion fatigue collectively. I identified some of my own experiences in working with particular populations as far as how I got into compassion fatigue, but we want to talk about compassion fatigue collectively today as far as how this phenomenon affects all of us, really. There are some things that we have gone through in the last 2, 3, 4 years that have really escalated and heightened compassion fatigue across the country. And so let's talk about some of those things. Let's talk about what we've gone through and some of those various factors and circumstances that we have faced that make compassion fatigue an important conversation across the board. So here are some of the things. I know that we're already thinking about some of, when I said in the last 2 or 3 years, some of these things probably quickly popped into your mind. We, of course, went through and survived a pandemic, which was very new, very different, kind of traumatic, stressful, maybe scary for most of us, all of those things. There were a lot of questions that we didn't have answers to, or we got a lot of conflicting answers to. So just the fact that we were in a pandemic for a period of time is a reason why we're talking about compassion fatigue. We also went through the elections. There was a lot of things happening in our government during the last few years. We saw a lot of social justice and injustice issues pop up in 2020, a lot of viral events that we all experienced and saw images and heard stories over and over and over and over again. Mass shootings. This is something that I have added to the slide recently because, of course, there's a prevalence in mass shootings that are happening throughout our country. The media is absolutely a contributor to this topic of compassion fatigue because the media feeds us stories, information, and images all day long. The media is also able to kind of direct our thoughts maybe on certain topics and give us information in ways that maybe can create even more panic or fear or frustration or sadness. And so the media definitely plays a part. Remote work is something different from all of us. I still work from home. A lot of organizations, individuals, professionals have returned to the workplace. The workplace is still different, and the work hours are different. When I am in the office, it's typically once, maybe twice a week. And I find that when I am in the office, I am there alone. So that's another reason why I haven't completely returned to the office, is because if I am going to work in a space by myself, I might as well stay home. So remote work definitely was a change that contributes to the conversation around compassion fatigue. Mental health, we're going to get into this, so I'm going to save that for a couple minutes. And then the length of time. The length of time refers to how long we have been in this space. The length of time refers to how long did the pandemic or the effects of the pandemic last for you personally? Was it just maybe you were an essential worker, you never took any time off, but you definitely still experienced the pandemic all around you in your household, and school closures, grocery store, a lot of various changes. The elections, the social justice, injustice issues, the mass shootings. When I say length of time, I'm really referring to how long we have been required to sit in particular spaces, and not actual physical spaces, but how long were we in the mental space of coping with the pandemic, or coping with social injustice, or coping with the images related to mass shootings, or how long have we been trying to identify or decide, are we going back to work? Are we not? Am I going to work in the office? Am I going to stay at home? So length of time really is another contributing factor to compassion fatigue. Is there any other things that you can think of that I don't have on the slide? And I'm sure there are plenty of different contributors, but feel free to drop some of those in the chat. If you can think of other things without even understanding compassion fatigue yet, but understanding this list as drivers of compassion fatigue, if you have other things that you want to drop in the chat, please do. So let's talk about taking inventory. I went through the list. I've asked you to drop some things into the chat, and I just want you to take maybe 20, 30 seconds to really reflect on some of these things. Maybe what feelings or emotions come up for you when we talk about some of these things, when you talk about social injustice, when you talk about the elections, when you talk about politics, the government, when you talk about the pandemic. What are some of the things or feelings that come up for you? And also feel free to drop some of those statements in the chat. Like I can remember, yeah, I was tired. I'm still tired. I'm still frustrated. I'm still a little anxious. It didn't faze me at all. Or, you know, I'm better today than I was in 2020, or 2020 was a long year. Feel free to add your comments into the chat. What I know is true is that many of us are still trying to process all of these factors. A lot of them have the stress of them has lessened, but they're still there. And that means that we all collectively in 2020, 2021, we were all experiencing some level of trauma. And any one of these, the pandemic, quarantine, social injustice, politics, mass shooting, any one of these can be traumatic. But as I've really identified, and the point that I'm really trying to drive home is we've experienced all of these things at the same time on top of one another over the last few years. And that really results in collective trauma, meaning we collectively experience trauma as a state, as a country, as a population. And so let's recognize how much we are required to process all day, every day. And while we're not in 2020, there are still things that occur on a regular basis that might bring us back to those same places. We might have, a mass shooting, and there are 2, 3, 4 months where we are just really sad and frustrated and overwhelmed that we can't make it stop. Or we know that when the elections are coming, that there's a lot of conversation, and whether I'm not identifying what side of the conversation you're on, but we know that that can bring up for some level of anxiety, that we don't want to see the posts, we don't want to engage in the conversations, we don't want to hear the debate. So it might not be 2020, but we still want to recognize and take inventory of the things that may contribute to our fatigue. So let's pause here and talk about mental health, because all of these things that we have discussed and identified, I can't see the chat, but some of the things that you maybe have added to the conversation through the chat absolutely affect our mental health in a variety of ways. But we need to have the conversation that mental health is a thing, it is affected, and something that we need to be aware and focus on. It's estimated that more than 1 in 5 adults in the U.S. Live with some sort of mental illness. In 2021, the number was 57.8 million adults living with some form of mental illness. A mental illness includes a variety of conditions. It can be anything from severe to mild to something moderate, and we'll talk about that. But we're not just talking about mania or schizophrenia, but when I say moderate, it could be something like agitation. Depression also has its own range. So you have mild or severe depression, or anxiety might also has a different range. So you might not be schizophrenic, but you're dealing with anxiety. And so we want to recognize the range when we talk about mental illness and how mental illness affects us. So when we hear about traumatic events, what we want to understand is just hearing about the events can lead to complicated emotions. We can have feelings of helplessness, we can become angry, we can be sad, we can feel shame or guilt. And after we experience unsettling or painful events, either personally or through the media, sometimes we dream about it. And when I say through the media, it's not a personal experience, but when things happen in our country, the media will play it on replay a lot. And so we experience a traumatic event through the media. And so much so that, like I said, we dream about it, we daydream about it. It just keeps replaying in our mind over and over and over and over again. And that means that we re-experience the images, the sounds, the feelings, and we find ourselves becoming disturbed and maybe preoccupied by these images. What we found recently through research is that in 2020 and 2021, not only in response to COVID, but also because of all the other tragedies and things that we witnessed, mental health actually has become a leading topic, and people have begun to recognize the urgency of attending to their mental health needs. Some of these things we have already discussed, but what I want to highlight here is that while mental health issues have increased, there are not always visible signs of mental health. So we don't always see it. And that means that I could be experiencing mental health issues, anxiety, depression right now, and you might not know. And so we want to just be aware of the reality of mental health variances, specifically in the workplace. And as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, on top of that, when we're working remotely, sometimes it's hard to identify changes or mental health concerns in our peers and colleagues. And so we just want to just be aware of just that it's prevalent. But the beautiful thing is that more people are focused on mental health, having the discussions, but the signs might not always be visible. So just know that it might not be on somebody's face, but there might be an experience. Your coworkers and peers, friends, neighbors might be experiencing some mental health issues. Mental health issues are more common than heart disease, diabetes, cancer. And so what we find is people generally have greater compassion. If you find out that somebody has been diagnosed with cancer, you feel some type of way, you feel a certain way, and we want to exercise the same compassion for those that are experiencing mental health issues, because they are very common. Not everybody understands or acknowledges their own mental health needs. We have to continue to show up, especially in the workplace, and appear to have it all together. So specifically as professionals in the workplace, it's a place where we, like this slide says, pull ourselves together and continue to move forward. And we want to have grace and compassion for that as well. Okay. All right, so we've done all of the pre-work. We've understood now how we got here. What are some of the topics? What are some of the triggers? What led to this increased conversation around compassion fatigue? I'm sorry, is there a question for me? Okay, I can only see my slides on the screen, so Elise just stop me if that was for me. But we've talked about some of the things, some of the triggers that prompted this greater conversation around compassion fatigue. We talked about all the things, the pandemic, the mass shootings, the politics, the elections, the mental health, the effects those things have on our mental health. And that brings us to our topic today, which is compassion fatigue. So now we're going to dive into this topic and definition of compassion fatigue, which is also known as secondary traumatic stress. And like I said on a previous slide, when we have an experience through the media, that can cause secondary traumatic stress. We weren't there, but media, pictures, storytelling, and repetition can make it so real to us that we also take on that experience. So let's talk about that. So compassion fatigue is a term that originated from the healthcare and animal care industries. It's a term used to describe how caregivers are affected by trauma that they see and experience every day. Trauma such as in the medical field dealing with parents in emergency, long-term care or hospice care, or trauma in the animal care field dealing with euthanasia, cruelty, hoarding, attacks, and emergencies. And that these are the places where compassion fatigue was really birthed out. And as you can imagine, if you work in hospice care and you're dealing with dying patients on a daily basis, or if you work in the animal field and you are, like it says, euthanasia, or you're witnessing animal cruelty on a regular basis, or hoarding, or even emergencies. And what that refers to is when there are, let's say, a flood or a fire. A lot of times, a lot of the focus is placed, of course, on the families and the households and making sure that people escape dangerous situations. But there are those in the animal care field that are trying to protect and save and rescue the animals in such emergencies. And so these two industries are how compassion fatigue was birthed. So compassion fatigue is not only the result of helping others who are suffering, in those cases medically, or in this case that we're talking about holistically. It's not just about helping people who are suffering from stress, trauma, or pain. It's also the result of exposure to the trauma of others. I mentioned before the media and our cell phones, our laptops really inundate us with this information and with stress and with trauma and with traumatic events. I wake up in the morning and I try not to immediately look at my phone, but my news app gives me a briefing of all of the top stories, and it's typically bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news. And like many of you, I have the iPhone, and it will send me alerts all day long about what's going on. And so we do become inundated with information. We can think back, some of us, without dating ourselves, to when we only got the news in the evening at 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock when we turned on the TV, or maybe 10 or 11 o'clock for the late night news. But now we really have access to this information all day throughout the day. Even when I'm working I get alerts that pop up on my laptop. And so we're saturated with information and trauma. We can become so saturated and traumatized that we begin to have nightmares, sleeping problems, anger, anxiety, depression, physical exhaustion, increased drinking, substance abuse, eating to cope with the stress, increase in judgment or resentment towards others, all of these things because of what we are inundated with on a daily basis. So compassion fatigue is emotional and physical exhaustion leading to a diminished ability to empathize or feel compassion for others. So that means that we're so inundated with that information that we, for lack of better terms, get tired of it. That's the definition of fatigue. We become tired and we no longer have the ability to empathize or feel compassion. That means that we've become depleted. It's a result of indirect trauma, listening to heart-wrenching or disturbing stories, seeing others in physical or emotional distress, or witnessing graphic injuries. Without creating trauma today, think about what youth go through or experience when there is a mass shooting. We were talking to some of our colleagues recently in Uvalde and just still having the conversation about how that community is trying to cope from that mass shooting. And those are some of the things that we're identifying today, is that it's listening to, we weren't there, we don't live in the community, we're not in Texas, but we still felt it. And for a period of time, all day, every day. And these again are the things that bring up compassion fatigue. So when we talk about compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress, we want to identify certain circumstances can cause us as individuals to be more susceptible to secondary traumatic stress. Personal exposure, our own exposure to events or to individuals who are coping with their own reactions, direct contact with traumatic stories, or helping others while neglecting ourselves. Though these are personal triggers, things that make us more susceptible. Are we really close to the event or the person? Do we have direct contact, or are we so involved, immersed, that we are helping so much that we are neglecting ourselves? We want to take care of others and be compassionate, engaged, and empathetic, but we need to understand that there is a cost sometimes to caring. And we want to make sure that we are managing the cost of caring effectively. We absolutely want to continue to care, be compassionate, engaged, sympathetic, and empathetic, as long as we are managing that cost of caring. Because constant empathy and sympathy do have a cumulative effect. And so our goal today is to create understanding around these things and understand the effects so that we can proactively manage the costs and the effects of being compassionate and empathetic, sympathetic individuals. So nurse and author, remember compassion fatigue did arise out of the healthcare industry. So nurse and author Terry Bogue finds that compassion fatigue sets in when we focus on other people and their needs before focusing on our own self-care needs. Important words. We're not saying not to focus, but we can't always put the focus on others before we put focus on ourselves. She says that when we forego the activities that bring us happiness without the capacity and without capacity flowing back in, we eventually run ourselves ragged. And when we identify too closely with those suffering, we'll find that we have nothing left to give. And these are examples of becoming depleted. For me, I shared my personal story of how I began to study and research around compassion fatigue. And for me, the second point is what was an indicator for me, foregoing the activities that bring us happiness. And I found that a lot of my hobbies, I'm a quilter, I'm a sewer, I'm a painter, I have a lot of activities, hobbies that I enjoy. And I found that I had pushed all of those things to the side and they were literally collecting dust. And so I found that because I had neglected those activities, because I wasn't refilling myself and doing the things that I needed to rest, relax, restore, rejuvenate, I did eventually run myself ragged and became depleted and experienced compassion fatigue on a great level. So Dr. Charles Figley describes compassion fatigue as the cost of caring, like we just said. He says compassion fatigue is a state experienced by those helping people or animals in distress. It is an extreme state of tension and preoccupation with the suffering of those being helped to the degree that it can create secondary traumatic stress for the helper. So it's an extreme state of tension that we are so engrossed and involved in well-doing, but that there's no balance there. That because we are so out of balance and concerned or consumed by the needs of others, that it ends up creating fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. I want to emphasize that compassion fatigue is two words. Compassion is important and fatigue is important. And we experience compassion fatigue out of the goodness of our heart, that we are so concerned and engrossed in busy helping others that we become fatigued. So this is not about, it's important to identify that this is making sure that we properly manage our good works. That yes, it is so important to care, to get involved, to do what we can, to be compassionate for people, but not to such an extreme state that we're putting all of our fun, hobbies, and things to the side and becoming fatigued, because then the opposite happens, and we'll talk about that. Then we no longer have patience and grace for people, and we're just over it. So we want to talk about what we can do before we get to that point. So there are 4 stages of compassion fatigue, according to researcher Charles Figley, who we just talked about on the previous slide. These are really like predictors, 4 predictors, if you will, of the stages of how we end up becoming in a state of fatigue. So first, empathetic ability. This involves this is where we start. We have the ability to notice other people's pains, that we're not blind to it, that we see it, that we're aware. We have empathetic concern, and we have a desire to relieve other people of their pain and suffering. So this is maybe hearing a story and it hits us. And we're already thinking, what can we do? How can we help? How do we fix it? What do we need to change? We have an ability to be empathetic. And then we go into our empathetic response. When we see a person experiencing pain, we then have an empathetic response. And this is where we engage in actions to understand the other person and explore ways to help. So in the first stage, we see it, we have the ability to be empathetic. And the second stage, we're responding empathetically with action. So we're busy working in stage 2, and we're in a groove, and I'm busy volunteering or lobbying or researching or communicating or marching, protesting, whatever you're doing, you're busy in that empathetic response. And then the third stage is empathetic stress. At this point, we might begin to experience a little residual compassion stress, particularly if there's still ongoing trauma, that we're doing the good work and the bad things are still continuing to happen. And if we can't manage compassion stress, we move into compassion fatigue, which we've defined. And so we find that we're starting to get tired, irritable. What's the point? I'm over it. I'm done. I just want to give up. Or in the same day, same moment, I have to do more. 8 hours a day is enough. What else can I do? And now I'm working 9 hours a day, 10 hours a day, 11 hours a day. I'm volunteering all over the place. But I'm stressed out because I'm tired. I'm tired, and there's still so much work to do. That's compassion stress. And then, of course, compassion fatigue, which we've talked about. And the risk of reaching this stage 4, compassion fatigue, is greater if we're exposed to this prolonged stress and trauma over a period of time, or new things are happening. And so we have we haven't really dealt with or healed from the initial thing that got us involved, and new things are continuing to happen. And I know I refer to the mass shootings often, but it seems like every time we start to heal from the sadness and the effects of the mass shooting, we get news that there's another one. So this is an example of like, I'm already doing the work and it's still happening. And so now I'm in compassion fatigue, where I'm too tired to go on. Okay, so we're going to talk about burnout and compassion fatigue. There is a difference. And the source of the feelings is what helps us identify what we're experiencing. The source or the root can tell us, are we dealing with burnout, or is this an issue of compassion fatigue? Compassion fatigue stems from exposure to trauma. So there's some traumatic event. Usually we can maybe even tie a date to it. I have been doing this work since XYZ date, while burnout is caused usually by excessive work-related stress. So one related specifically usually to trauma with a date attached, one happens specifically related to work. And we get this question a lot. What is the difference? Because a lot of times when I say compassion fatigue, people automatically think of burnout. And so it's important to have the conversation and identify what the differences and similarities between the two. So burnout tends to happen slowly over time. That we're just starting to get tired. Maybe you've been in your role for 12, 17, 18 years, and you're starting to get tired. You've been doing it a long time. It's typically caused by occupational stress and overwork. That can cause burnout, that maybe you're short-staffed, your department is missing 1 or 2 FTEs. And so over time, you were happy to jump in and absorb the extra work for a period of time, but eventually it becomes stressful and you feel overworked. That creates work dissatisfaction. It's often linked to excessive pressure, such as deadlines, multiple deadlines, competing deadlines, last-minute deadlines. And burnout leads to a loss of motivation, energy, and interest. And that's when we find in the workplace, maybe employees are now, you used to be a high performer, and now you're finding that I'm just doing the bare minimum to stay compliant. I don't have a lot of energy. I'm not being innovative. I don't really have any good new ideas anymore. I'm just going to go with what I've been doing on autopilot. Then there's compassion fatigue. Where burnout tends to happen over time, compassion fatigue may occur suddenly. Like we said, it's tied to an event. It's caused by caring for people who are suffering. Burnout creates worse work satisfaction. Compassion fatigue can create life dissatisfaction, excuse me. And that means like, what am I here for? How come I can't make a difference? It just all is starting to look bleak. Compassion fatigue happens when people feel helpless or out of control. Like I said, I'm trying to make change and it's not changing fast enough. And it leads to a lack of empathy, maybe even some PTSD symptoms. And then we know that we have talked about the secondary trauma. So both, though, there are some similarities between compassion fatigue and burnout. There are some parallels. So for example, both can cause emotional exhaustion, negativity, and irritation. Both can create a reduced sense of personal accomplishment or meaning in work. Both can result in decreased social interactions. Specifically, when we talk about working remote, decreased interactions can look like I used to always have my camera on. I used to be engaged for every meeting. I used to chat with my coworkers in the chat box, and now I technically log into the meeting, my camera's not on. I don't really engage, that I'm kind of starting to withdraw even in a remote work environment. Depersonalization is misplaced anger and anxiety, that I'm frustrated with one person as a result of something else that I'm experiencing, or I'm anxious in this situation as a result of something that's happening in another state. And then it can also both could lead to physical and mental exhaustion. That's, for example, fatigue. We're unable to focus. We're not as responsive. Even dry eye syndrome is a physical manifestation of our body being fatigued and burnt out. So remember to listen to your body. If you're going through new experiences in your body, I didn't used to have dry eye. I'm getting headaches more often. I'm restless. I'm not sleeping as well. I have aches and pains. Might be a sign of burnout, compassion fatigue, meaning that we need to engage in more self-care. All right, so speaking engaging in self-care, we're going to do just a quick breathing exercise, kind of bring us down. I know that talking about these topics can be triggering. In another instance, I talk about trauma in another one of my courses, and I just want to create awareness around the fact that I brought up a lot of things that can be triggering: burnout, fatigue, the pandemic, social injustice, a lot of different topics. And so let's just take 5 minutes to reflect and recenter. I'm going to just lead you through a quick breathing exercise. Should just take about 20 seconds or so. So we're going to just breathe in, tracing our hand, breathe out on the inside, breathe in, breathe out. Feel free to trace your hand along with me. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. And breathe out. Breathe out. Perfect. Just an opportunity for a deep breath. We're moving into the final portion of our conversation today. We're going to talk about some coping strategies. So we're going to leave all the trauma and traumatic examples in the first half and take a deep breath, move into the second half. So let's talk about coping strategies. Now we know what compassion fatigue is. We understand what can cause, create, exasperate compassion fatigue. What can we do about it? So here are 4 strategies that we can engage in to address compassion fatigue. These 4 cornerstones can help you move through compassion fatigue, identify it and address it and correct it before it really takes us out. And by take us out, I just mean that, you have those weekends where you don't want to move. I don't mean take us out, but before it can get the best of us is probably a better way to say that. So the 4 cornerstones: awareness, setting boundaries, creating a support system, and self-care. So awareness. This slide addresses some typical symptoms to be aware of. And so we want to look at just creating awareness around, first of all, knowing that compassion fatigue exists. And that awareness is us understanding, I'm going to do this work, I'm going to volunteer, I'm going to get engaged, I'm going to do what I can, but I also recognize that compassion fatigue exists and I need to be aware so that I don't end up in that space. We need to understand our own triggers and pain points. Are there areas where we maybe shouldn't volunteer, get involved? Or do we understand that I'm going to do this work, but this is a trigger for me? This is probably really going to affect me emotionally or mentally. This is going to maybe bring up some feelings for me. And so I need to be aware, understand my triggers and my pain points so that I can engage in self-care when I need to. And again, knowing what events and situations cause an unusually strong reaction. There are some things that we read and it's painful, it's alarming, it's annoying, it's frustrating, and we read it and we move on. And there are other things that we read, encounter, see, witness that we just can't shake. And we need to be aware of those events or situations that cause unusually strong reactions. We need to understand when our ability to function is altered. Understand when we're getting to that, when we're getting to that point. What situations feel traumatic? And maybe even if it wasn't us experiencing personally the information, but it feels very traumatic to us. we need to be aware of those situations. And then finally, a sign that we're becoming fatigued is that we wake up feeling fatigued, that you're not sleeping good, as I mentioned, you're tossing and turning, you're maybe dreaming about traumatic events, being aware that when I am doing these things, when I suddenly don't have an ability to function well, I'm not doing the hobbies and the things that I love, things feel traumatic to me, even though I didn't personally experience in them, and I'm tired all the time, I'm aware that these are signs of compassion fatigue. So after awareness comes setting boundaries. Setting emotional boundaries helps maintain a connection while still remembering and honoring the fact that you are a separate person with your own individual specific needs. So setting boundaries, boundaries are limits that we set in order to create a healthy sense of personal space. Our boundaries can be physical or emotional. An example of a physical boundary is as knowing what you need to function at your best and to thrive. A physical boundary can be, hey, can you not set a meeting for 8 a.m. because I get in at 8 a.m. and that doesn't allow me time to like set my things down, wrap my thoughts around what we need to discuss today. And sometimes when we have a meeting first thing in the morning, it sets the tone for our entire day and we feel a little stressed and edgy and it's hard to get out of that feeling. So a physical boundary can be to ask your team, hey, we all start at 8. Can we not have any meetings before 8:30 or 9? Or, hey, the workday ends at 5. A physical boundary for me is that please don't reach out after 5. Like, please don't, on our team, in my organization, create a draft email, but don't send it after 5 because we know that people, we love the work that we do. And so we tend to respond. And then the next thing you know, it's 8 o'clock and you're still working on things. So a physical boundary can be, hey, please don't reach out. Don't email after hours. A physical boundary could be, hey, I don't discuss my personal information at the workplace. Like, I don't like to talk about my spouse or my kids or where I came from or how I grew up. That's an example of a boundary. And boundaries help us identify behaviors that are acceptable or unacceptable to us. Okay. I'm suddenly having mouse issues. Sorry about that. So setting boundaries is easier said than done. First thing to note is setting boundaries is important, but it doesn't always mean that others will honor them. And that's an unfortunate fact, but we need to be aware that we set boundaries, but that doesn't mean that people will always honor them. But we need to do our part in communicating our boundaries assertively. Sometimes people don't honor our boundaries in the way that we're communicating them. So if you say, if perhaps maybe you could possibly versus, hey team, let's not start our meetings before 8:30. So if we communicate our boundaries assertively, there's a better chance that they will be honored. And then it's okay to update your boundaries as needed. So my boundaries this year might be different from my boundaries 2 years ago, or it might be different from the boundaries 2 years in the future. So it's okay to update your boundaries. It's okay to say, I actually have the hang of things. I end up waking up early every day. I'm ready to go by 8 o'clock and change the boundary, or say, whatever it is, it's okay to update your boundaries. They're your boundaries. They're personal to you. So there's no hard, fast rule as to when you can and cannot update your boundaries. Okay, and next, create a support system. There's immense value in creating a support system, but like this first bullet point says, you have to be your own advocate first, take care of yourself first, support your own mental, physical, and emotional needs first. So you want to have a support system, but your system does not come before you. So that's most important. Have a support system that you trust. So when you are in a space where you're becoming fatigued, you have people, friends, family, mentors around you to say, hey, when's the last time you painted? When's the last time you went for a hike? When's the last time you booked a trip? All those things that you love to do. Those reminders can come from your support system. We need to acknowledge the emotional toll of our own roles in our organizations and our professions. And that's why professional mentors are important, because those are the people that say, you're being very hard on yourself, but do you realize that you yourself individually manage all 45 of your staff by yourself? So you're the executive director and your director of human resources, and you work with a very challenging population. So take it easy on yourself, and recognize the emotional toll of your work. Allow time to decompress. Build in post-project time to come down. That was one benefit definitely of commuting for me before I started working from home, is that drive home was an opportunity to really reflect what went well, what didn't, what am I going to focus on next time, what changes am I going to make? And then by the time you get to your destination, to your family, to your friends, to your pets, that you've had an opportunity to decompress. And so there's not stress on top of stress. For me, sometimes coming home from work or when the family gets home, that's not downtime. That's time for a new job, right? As parents. So we need time to decompress in between those roles. It's okay to ask for help and reach out to our resources. It's okay when we're feeling fatigued, when we're feeling challenged in our mental health, when we are losing compassion for people, when we're losing patience. It's important to ask for help and ask for resources. It's okay to delegate, know your limits, use your support system. Your support system is not only people, your support system is these things. Your support system is delegation, decompression, resources. All of this is your support system. So know your limits and be realistic and stay realistic about what you can and can't do. That sounds like a great opportunity for us as an organization, as a department. I personally can't take that on. Can you ask Justin to take the lead on that? It's okay to delegate. Reach out to online networks and groups. Again, you have a close support system, and maybe an online or a virtual network of peers, maybe in the similar field as you. But it's good to read, get on a distribution list for articles that offer resources, perspective, and insight that can help us cope and manage the stress of our daily lives. And have regular conversations with your leadership team. Check in with your coworkers, with your friends, neighbors, pets, spouse, whoever your people are, but talk through your stressors. It's important to check in and have regular conversations. I have 3 kids at home, one in elementary, one in middle school, and one in high school. And this is something that I do with my kids often, is check in with them. And I'm working on training them to talk through their stressors. I realize that even though the little one is in elementary school, there are stressors in elementary, there are stressors in middle school, and specifically also with my oldest in high school. I am training them to talk through and have regular conversations with their support systems. Okay, and my favorite, self-care. Self-care is my favorite, and there's no more important coping strategy than another, but this is a very, very, very important strategy, self-care. Like I said on the last slide, we have to be our own advocates first. We take care of ourselves first. We recognize our triggers first. So we get to be our own best friends. So self-care, first of all, is different from everyone. For everyone, I can't tell you what self-care looks like because it is regulated. So whatever it looks like for you, that is the thing that you should be focused on when we talk about self-care. Self-care is different for everyone, but it should be done daily. Trying to push through or work ahead is not an example of self-care. And what I mean by this is a lot of times as professionals, we try to, if I can just make it to December for the winter vacation, I'll be fine. Pushing through is not an example of self-care. Or if I can just finish and make it through the weekend, even though I'm exhausted, depleted, overwhelmed, have anxiety, and my body is starting to ache on Tuesday, self-care needs to be done daily and not pushed off. So don't push through and schedule self-care into the future. It should be done daily. And that means if you have to schedule your self-care, then schedule your self-care. Nurture yourself by putting activities on your schedule that are sources of pleasure and joy and diversion. So if you have to schedule a massage, you have to schedule a walk, you have to schedule a trip to the grocery store for your favorite ice cream, if you have to schedule a bubble bath, if you have to schedule a round of golf, whatever it is, a pickup basketball game, put it on your calendar like we put everything else on the calendar. Celebrate small wins. When you do something amazing that might seem insignificant, celebrate it. I accomplished everything on my to-do list today. That's amazing, especially for us professionals in the workplace, where that list can sometimes grow and grow and grow. Or you maybe engaged in a difficult conversation that you've been putting off, or you wanted to do some research and find out if you are interested in working in a particular field or with a particular group. Whatever that small thing is, celebrate it. Redefine rest and recovery. What is that for you? What does recovery look like? For some, recovery is not sitting on the couch and watching movies on the weekend. For some, recovery is being outdoors. I need to go for a hike. I need to go for a walk. Rest for me is actually with all 3 kids and the dog and my husband, right? So redefine rest and recovery for you. And again, like on every slide, get professional assistance if you need it. If you have a hard time engaging in self-care, or if you have put self-care off for so long that you need to do additional work to get to that steady place of self-care, engage in professional assistance. And that doesn't always mean a therapist or psychologist. That can be a personal trainer. It can be somebody to teach you cooking classes, somebody to teach painting classes, professional. It's just that any professional in any area where you need assistance in your self-care. Avoid competitive self-care. This is important. Self-care, again, is for yourself, and you have to do what works for you, not what works for your neighbors or your friends or your coworkers or your spouse. The example I always give is my friend and mentor is in the 5 a.m. club and will often be up and working and running or at the gym by 5 a.m., which means at 4 a.m., he's already responded to some emails. He's already done his reflection and meditation for the day. I am not a morning person, so I'm not going to engage in self-care by going to the gym at 5 a.m. Because that is not my jam. So don't do competitive self-care as in what everybody else is doing for their self-care. The same way where if you're not a painter, I can't recommend that you paint for self-care if that's not what you enjoy. Don't ignore signs of fatigue. Avoid self-medicating. That's a rabbit hole. Sometimes when we get exhausted or overwhelmed, we can turn to other things to medicate even the aches and pains in our bodies. But we want to make sure that we're engaging in active, healthy forms of self-care and not going down rabbit holes there. Don't neglect your own needs and interests, and don't feel shame or guilt for resting. Even in our well-doing, when we are compassionate for people and engaged, concerned about what's going on around us, and we want to help, it's okay to take a time out. And we don't want to feel ashamed or guilty for taking that time out. That is a coping strategy and a very important one. All of these examples of self-care, please find what works for you. So with that, I'm done. But as a point of reflection, I would just ask you to be mindful of these things throughout the rest of your day. I definitely appreciate the time that you spent with me in this hour. But at some point today, ask yourself how you would rate your current self-care routine. Are there any changes that you need to make to cope or combat compassion fatigue? Where are you? Are you just maybe getting involved, or are you already finding yourself stressed out and entering into that space of compassion fatigue? Where are you? Are there things that you used to enjoy doing that you find that you haven't done in a while and you want to start doing them again? Boundaries. Do you need to communicate or set new boundaries? All of the things that we talked about today, I would just ask that you take some time to reflect, in a meaningful way, check in with yourself, and create a new self-care list and habit. So again, with that, I thank you. I appreciate your time today. I hope that I have given you information that is useful and insightful. The opposite of compassion fatigue is compassion satisfaction, the pleasure you derive from being able to do your work. And it has been my true pleasure and honor to spend this time with you today. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Angela Love, for this wonderful presentation. I just wanted to let everyone know, chime in. Thank you guys for being a part of this presentation. We really appreciate your attendance here. Thank you for being with us today. And again, thank you, Dr. Love, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us here today as well. For everyone asking, the presentation, this recording will be available later this afternoon. You can access it in the link I'm going to post in the chat in just a moment, but you will be able to watch the recording there later today. It has to upload and it takes a while. So just check back later in the afternoon and I will post it right now.
Robin, hi, I see you. Good to see you.
Linda, you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yes, is it possible to get a copy of this PowerPoint?
Dr. Love, did you want to share the PowerPoint or just the recording?
I will need to check in with my team. Can I let you know? And then if
Yeah,
I
no
give
problem.
you, okay.
Sure. If we do share the presentation, you guys, it will be on the same link as the recording. And again, you could find that later this afternoon if we decide to upload it, okay?
That would be
And I'll
great.
post
Thank
it
you.
again in the chat. Sure. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Hi, Robin. I see your hand up. What a lovely surprise.
Feel exactly the same way. I'd been registered for this workshop for quite some time. And then when I popped in and saw that you were teaching, I was elated.
Oh,
It is so
God.
good to see you.
You too. I'm just so amazed that you're here. Thank you so much for staying and for joining us today. It's wonderful to see your
Absolutely.
face.
Well, you know, when you get an opportunity to learn from the masters and the experts, you got to take notes. I got a pen. I've been writing, girl.
Oh, that's so awesome. That's so awesome. Thank you so much. It's so cool that you're here.
Well, I'm very grateful to the universe that they put us in